The Great Hall of Station Meridian was filled with beings from across the galaxy. They came in all shapes and sizes. Some had scales, others had fur, and a few were made of crystal that caught the light in strange ways. The air hummed with the sound of translation devices, working hard to turn one language into another. Daniel Reyes stood near the back of the human delegation, watching everything with wide eyes. He was 26 years old, fresh out of the academy, and this was his first real assignment. His job was simple: listen, take notes, and stay out of the way. Commander Patricia Holloway had made that very clear on the shuttle ride over. "We are new here," Patricia had told him. "The other species have been doing this for thousands of years. We watch. We learn. We do not make waves." Daniel had nodded and promised to be invisible. But now, standing in this massive chamber with 17 different species arguing about trade routes and borderlines, he found it hard to stay quiet. His mind kept drifting to the old alien sitting at the center of the room. Her name was Ambassador Vithara, and she belonged to a species called the Korlani. They were tall and thin, with skin like black glass and eyes that changed color like oil floating on water. The Korlani had been part of the Galactic Council for longer than most species have been traveling between stars. They were respected, even feared, for their wisdom. But Ambassador Vithara was different. She was old, even by Korlani standards. Her movements were slow and careful. When she spoke, her voice was soft and hard to hear, and the things she said made no sense to anyone. "The river remembers the stone that shaped it," she said during a discussion about mining rights. The other diplomats paused, looked at each other, and then continued talking as if she had not spoken at all. Daniel saw a few of them roll their eyes or shake their heads. One of the Morthani representatives, a creature that looked like a bear made of metal, laughed quietly. Daniel felt something twist in his chest. It was not right to laugh at an old woman, even if she was an alien. He pulled out his tablet and made a note of what she had said. He did not know why. It just seemed important. The session went on for hours. Species argued about who owned what piece of space, who had the right to trade with whom, and whether certain weapons should be banned from certain sectors. Through it all, Ambassador Vithara sat quietly. Sometimes she closed her eyes as if sleeping. Other times she watched the speakers with those strange, colorful eyes, and sometimes she spoke. Stars do not argue. With the darkness between them, she said when two species threatened. War over a small moon. The child who fears the storm forgets that rain feeds the garden, she offered. When the discussion turned to refugee policies, each time, the chamber ignored her. Each time, Daniel wrote down her words. When the session finally ended, Daniel found himself standing near the Korlani section of the hall. A younger Korlani, maybe middle-aged by their standards, was helping Ambassador Vithara to her feet. He moved with the impatience of someone who had done this many times before. "Excuse me," Daniel said, stepping forward. The younger Korlani looked at him with surprise. Humans did not usually approach other delegations directly. It was considered rude. "Yes?" the Korlani said. His name tag read Korath Junior Diplomat. "I was wondering about Ambassador Vithara," Daniel said. "Her statements during the session. Do they have a specific meaning in your culture?" Korath's expression shifted. For a moment, Daniel thought he saw something like sadness there. Then it was gone, replaced by a polite smile. "The ambassador is very old," Korath said carefully. "Her mind wanders. We keep her here out of respect for her long service. You should not pay attention to her words. They mean nothing." Daniel wanted to argue. He wanted to say that the words did not feel like nothing. But Patricia's warning echoed in his head. "Do not make waves." "I understand," Daniel said. "Thank you for explaining." He stepped back and watched as Korath led Ambassador Vithara away. Just before they disappeared through a doorway, the old diplomat turned her head and looked directly at Daniel. Her eyes shifted through colors he had no name for, and she smiled. It was a small smile, barely there at all. But it hit Daniel like a punch to the chest. She knows, he thought. She knows exactly what she is saying. That night, Daniel could not sleep. He sat in his small quarters on the human ship, staring at his tablet. He had recorded every word Ambassador Vathara had spoken during the session. There were 14 statements in total, each one stranger than the last. He started with the first one. The river remembers the stone that shaped it. The context was a discussion about mining rights. Two species, the Morthani and the Selvax, had been fighting over the same asteroid field for generations. The Morthani wanted to extract metals. The Selvax needed crystals that grew there for some biological purpose. Daniel did not fully understand. A river. A stone. What could that have to do with asteroids? Daniel pulled up everything he could find about Kolani language and culture. The files were thin. The Kolani were private people, and they did not share much with outsiders. But there were a few academic papers, written by linguists who had studied their public speeches. One paper caught his attention. It was about the layers of meaning in Kolani communication. The author argued that the Kolani did not just speak with words. They spoke with context, with timing, with the positions of their bodies relative to their listeners. A single sentence could mean 10 different things, depending on when and how it was said. Daniel sat up straighter. What if Ambassador Vathar was not speaking nonsense? What if she was speaking in a way that no one understood anymore? He looked at his notes again. The river remembers the stone that shaped it. The mining dispute was about history. Both species claimed they had been using the asteroid field first. Both had old records and ancient treaties that supported their claims. They were stuck in the past, unable to move forward. The river remembers the stone. The past shapes the present. But the river is still a river. It flows on. Was she saying that the history mattered, but should not stop progress? Was she suggesting they find a way to honor the past while still moving forward? Daniel's heart beat faster. He moved to the next statement, then the next. Each one seemed to connect to the discussion happening around it. Each one seemed to offer a perspective that no one else was considering. By morning, Daniel had a theory. It was wild and probably wrong, but he could not shake the feeling that he was onto something. He needed to talk to Patricia. He needed to convince her that the crazy old alien diplomat might be the wisest person in the room, and he needed to figure out how to make the galaxy listen. Commander Patricia Holloway listened to Daniel for exactly 3 minutes before holding up her hand. "Stop," she said. "Let me understand what you are telling me. You think the old Kolani diplomat, the one everyone says has lost her mind, is actually speaking in some kind of secret language?" Daniel nodded. "Not secret, exactly. Old. I think she is speaking in an older form of Kolani, one that has layers and meanings that the translation devices cannot pick up." Patricia leaned back in her chair. Her office on the human ship was small and plain, with metal walls and a single window that looked out at the stars. She was a practical woman, more interested in results than theories. Daniel knew he had to convince her quickly, or she would send him back to his quarters with orders to stop wasting time. "I spent all night going through her statements," Daniel continued. "Every single one connects to the discussion that was happening when she spoke. She's not rambling. She's responding. She's offering solutions." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "Solutions that no one can understand, because they are not listening the right way." Daniel pulled out his tablet and showed her his notes. "Look at this one. During the refugee discussion, she said, 'The child who fears the storm forgets that rain feeds the garden.' The Selvax were arguing that accepting refugees would drain their resources. The Morthani were saying that refusing refugees made them look weak. Neither side was willing to move. And what does rain in gardens have to do with any of that? Daniel took a breath. In Kalani culture, rain is a symbol of change that seems harmful but brings growth. A storm is frightening, but without it, nothing new can grow. I think she was saying that accepting refugees might seem like a burden, but it could bring benefits that neither side was considering. New workers, new skills, new perspectives. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the notes on his tablet, then back at his face. Daniel could not tell if she believed him or thought he was crazy. "Even if you are right," she finally said, "what do you expect us to do about it? We are the newest species in this council. We have no influence. If we stand up and say that everyone has been ignoring valuable wisdom for decades, they will laugh us out of the chamber." "Maybe," Daniel admitted. "But what if we start small? What if we just try to translate one of her statements publicly? If I am wrong, we look foolish but harmless. If I am right, we could help solve a problem that has been stuck for years." Patricia studied him. Daniel felt like she was looking right through him, measuring his character and his commitment. He tried not to fidget. "You really believe this?" she said. "It was not a question. I do." She sighed and rubbed her forehead. "Fine. I will give you access to the council archives. You have 3 days to build a stronger case. If you can show me clear evidence that the ambassador's statements match the contexts in which they were given, I will consider letting you present your findings to the delegation leaders." Daniel felt a rush of relief and excitement. "Thank you, Commander. I will not let you down. You had better not. Now get out of my office and get to work." The council archives were massive. They contained recordings of every session going back 500 years. Daniel requested everything that featured Ambassador Vethara and settled in for what he knew would be days of difficult work. The first recordings were from 80 years ago, when Vethara was already considered old, but still spoke in a way that others understood. Her language was formal and precise. She negotiated treaties, resolved disputes, and earned the respect of every species in the chamber. Watching those recordings, Daniel could see why the Korlani were proud of her. Then, slowly, things began to change. About 50 years ago, Vethara started using more metaphors and indirect language. The other diplomats seemed confused but still tried to engage with her. The Korlani delegation would sometimes step in to explain what she meant. 20 years ago, the explanation stopped. The younger Korlani diplomats would just smile and change the subject when Vethara spoke. The other species stopped asking for clarification. Vethara became background noise, present but not heard. Daniel focused on those 20 years. He created a database of every statement she made and the context in which she made it. He cross-referenced Korlani cultural documents, looking for symbols and meanings that might unlock her words. The pattern became clearer with each passing hour. Vethara was not speaking randomly. She was responding to the emotional core of each discussion, cutting through the political nonsense to address what really mattered. Her language was dense and layered, requiring knowledge of Korlani history, astronomy, and social structure to fully understand. But why had her own people stopped translating for her? Daniel found the answer in a cultural report from 40 years ago. The Korlani had undergone a generational shift. The younger diplomats had been raised speaking council standard, the common language used by all species in the chamber. They learned Old Korlani as children, but rarely used it as adults. Over time, they forgot the deeper layers, the subtle meanings that made the language so powerful. Ambassador Vethara was speaking a language that her own grandchildren could no longer understand. Daniel felt a strange mix of sadness and excitement. Sad because an entire way of thinking was being lost. Excited because maybe, Just maybe he could help recover it. He worked through the night and into the next day. By the time Patricia came to check on him, he had built a comprehensive analysis of 50 different statements and their corresponding contexts. The matches were too consistent to be coincidence. "Show me," Patricia said. Daniel walked her through his findings. Statement by statement, he showed how Vathor's words aligned with the discussions happening around her. He explained the Kolani symbols and how they connected to the topics being debated. He pointed out cases where her suggestions, if understood, could have resolved conflicts that ended up dragging on for years. When he finished, Patricia was silent for a long time. "This is real," she said finally. Her voice was soft, almost awed. She has been trying to help all this time, and no one could hear her. "Yes," Daniel said. "And I think I can translate for her. Not perfectly, not yet, but enough to show the council what they have been missing." Patricia looked at him with new respect. "You understand what this could mean for humanity. If we are the ones who unlock this wisdom, it could change our position in the galaxy entirely." Daniel had thought about that a lot, but in his heart, that was not why he wanted to do this. "I understand," he said. "But honestly, Commander, I just want to give an old woman her voice back." Patricia smiled. It was the first time Daniel had seen her smile since they left Earth. "That," she said, "might be the most human thing I have ever heard. Let us do this." The day of the crisis came without warning. Daniel woke to alarms blaring through the human ship and Patricia's voice on the intercom ordering all senior staff to the briefing room. He threw on his uniform and ran. The briefing room was already crowded when he arrived. Officers clustered around display screens, showing maps of a distant sector. Red warning lights blinked at several points. "What is happening?" Daniel asked a nearby ensign. "The Morthani and Selvax," the ensign said grimly. "They moved warships into the disputed asteroid field overnight. Both sides are demanding the other withdraw. Neither is backing down." Daniel felt his stomach drop. The mining dispute he had been studying for days was about to become a war. Patricia stood at the front of the room, talking rapidly into a communication device. When she saw Daniel, she waved him over. "This is it," she said. "The Council is calling an emergency session. Every species will be there. If there is any chance of stopping this, it has to happen today." Daniel understood what she was asking. "Ambassador Vathara will speak. She always does during important sessions. And you need to be ready to translate." Patricia gripped his shoulder. "Are you ready?" Daniel thought about everything he had learned over the past 3 days. He thought about the old diplomat with the oil-colored eyes. He thought about the weight of what he was about to attempt. "I am ready," he said. The emergency session was chaos. The great chamber of Station Meridian had never felt so tense. The Morthani delegation sat on one side, their metal bodies gleaming under the lights. The Selvax sat on the other, their crystalline forms humming with barely contained energy. Between them, the other 15 species watched nervously, knowing that a war between two major powers would affect everyone. Daniel took his place beside Patricia in the human section. They were positioned near the back, as always, but Patricia had arranged for a clear path to the center of the chamber. If the moment came, Daniel would need to move fast. The session moderator, a being made of living crystal called the Veth Speaker, called for order. Its voice rang through the chamber like a bell. "We are here to address the crisis in Sector 7, the Veth Speaker announced. The Morthani Collective and the Selvax Union have both moved military forces into contested space. We call upon both delegations to explain their actions." What followed was 2 hours of accusations and counter-accusations. The Morthani claimed the Selvax had violated ancient treaties. The Selvax claimed the Morthani had been stealing resources for decades. Old wounds were reopened. Old hatreds were remembered. The temperature in the room seemed to rise with each passing minute. Daniel watched Ambassador Vathar throughout. She sat motionless in her seat, eyes closed, apparently asleep. The younger Korlani diplomats ignored her completely, focused on taking notes and whispering among themselves. Then, during a particularly heated exchange, Vathara opened her eyes. Daniel sat up straighter. He had seen this pattern in the recordings. She only spoke when something important needed to be said. The old diplomat rose slowly to her feet. The movement was so unexpected that the arguing delegates fell silent. Every eye in the chamber turned to her. When she spoke, her voice was thin but clear. "The hunter and the gatherer both need the forest," she said. "But only the child asks which trees bear fruit in which season." Silence. Then the Morthani representative made a dismissive sound and turned back to his prepared arguments. The Selvax representative shook her head. The moment was about to pass, just like all the others. Daniel stood up. Patricia grabbed his arm. "Are you sure?" He looked at her, then at the old diplomat who was slowly sinking back into her seat. "I have never been more sure of anything." He pulled free and walked toward the center of the chamber. His footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet. 17 species watched him approach, probably wondering what the young human thought he was doing. "If I may address the council," Daniel said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. The Veth speaker turned its many facets toward him. For a moment, Daniel thought it would refuse. Humans had no standing to interrupt emergency sessions. "The human delegation has the floor," the Veth speaker said. Daniel breathed. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of beings that were older, wiser, and more powerful than he could imagine. Then he began. "Ambassador Vathar has just proposed a solution to this crisis," he said. "With your permission, I would like to translate her words." The reaction was immediate. The Morthan representative laughed out loud. Several other delegates exchanged looks of disbelief. The Kolani delegation shifted uncomfortably, but the Veth speaker raised a crystalline hand for silence. "Continue," it said. Daniel turned to face the two hostile delegations. "The ambassador said that the hunter and the gatherer both need the forest. She is speaking of both of your peoples. You both need the resources of the asteroid field. This is true." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "She also said that only the child asks which trees bear fruit in which season. In Kolani culture, the child represents someone with fresh eyes, someone who asks questions that adults have forgotten to ask." The chamber was utterly silent now. Daniel could feel the weight of attention pressing on him from every direction. "The asteroid field is not static," he continued. "The orbits of the asteroids bring different resources to accessible positions at different times of the year. The tungsten deposits that the Morthani need are most exposed during one season. The crystals that the Selvax require for their reproductive cycle are most accessible during another." He looked at the Morthani representative, then at the Selvax. "You have been fighting over who owns the field, but the ambassador is suggesting that you share it, not by dividing the space, but by dividing the time. A joint survey, conducted by a neutral party, could map which resources are available when. You could take turns." The Morthani representative's metallic face was unreadable, but he did not laugh this time. "And who would be this neutral party?" the Selvax representative asked. Her voice was cautious but not hostile. Daniel had not planned to answer this question, but the words came anyway. "Humanity. We have no history with either of your peoples. We have no stake in your conflict. We are the child who asks which trees bear fruit." Silence again. Then, from across the chamber, a sound that Daniel had never expected to hear. Ambassador Vathara was laughing. It was a soft sound, like wind through dry leaves, but it carried through the chamber. When Daniel turned to look at her, She was smiling at him with those shifting, colorful eyes. She spoke again, and this time Daniel understood her perfectly. At last, she said in Old Korlani. Someone was listening. The negotiations that followed lasted 6 more hours. But by the end of the day, the warships were withdrawing. The Morthani and Selvax had agreed to a joint survey of the asteroid field, to be conducted by the human delegation. Daniel sat in the empty chamber after everyone else had left. He was exhausted, overwhelmed, and strangely happy. Patricia found him there an hour later. "You did it," she said, sitting down beside him. "She did it," Daniel replied. "I just help people here." Patricia smiled and put a hand on his shoulder. "That is what humans do best, Daniel. We listen. And today, you reminded the entire galaxy why that matters." The days after the translation changed everything. Daniel could not walk through Station Meridian without being stopped by someone who wanted to talk to him. Diplomats who had ignored the human delegation for weeks now sought meetings. Journalists from a dozen worlds requested interviews. His face appeared on news broadcasts across the galaxy. He hated it. Daniel had never wanted to be famous. He had just wanted to understand the language that no one else was paying attention to. Now he found himself at the center of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. Patricia did her best to protect him from the worst of the attention. She assigned security officers to escort him through the station. She screened his communications and filtered out the requests that seemed suspicious or harmful. But she could not protect him from everything. The first warning came 3 days after the translation. Daniel returned to his quarters to find a message waiting on his personal tablet. It was written in Council Standard, but the style was formal and cold. "You have disrupted arrangements that were centuries in the making. Some prefer conflict to peace. Some profit from misunderstanding. You would be wise to remember that not everyone wants to hear what the old one has to say." There was no signature, no return address. Just those words, glowing on the screen like a threat. Daniel showed the message to Patricia. "I expected this," she said, her face grim. The Selvax and Morthani hardliners had a lot invested in that conflict. Weapons contracts, political power, alliances built on the fear of war. You took that away from them in a single afternoon. So, what do? You stay careful. You travel with guards. And you keep doing what you are doing, because that is the only way to make the threat meaningless. Daniel nodded, but the weight of the situation pressed on his chest. He had never thought of himself as brave. He was a linguist, a scholar, someone who preferred books to battlefields. Now he was being told that powerful beings wanted him silenced. That evening, he received a different kind of message. It came from the Korlani delegation, an official invitation to meet privately with Ambassador Vathora in her quarters. Daniel went alone, despite Patricia's objections. He felt that he owed the old diplomat that much. Vathora's quarters were unlike anything else on Station Meridian. The walls were covered with artifacts from 100 worlds. Strange plants grew in pots of soil that smelled like nothing on Earth. Soft light came from crystals, placed in careful patterns around the room. The ambassador herself sat in a chair that seemed to hold her gently, supporting her thin frame. Korath stood nearby, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," Vathora said. Her voice was stronger than it had been in the council chamber. Here, in her own space, she seemed more present, more alive. "Thank you for inviting me," Daniel replied. He was not sure of the proper way to greet a Korlani elder, so he simply bowed his head. Vathora smiled. "You may sit. We have much to discuss." Daniel sat on a low cushion across from her. Korath brought a drink that tasted like honey and flowers, then retreated to a corner of the room. "I want to understand," Daniel said. "Why did you keep speaking in Old Korlani when no one could hear you?" Vidara's eyes shifted through colors as she considered the question. Because someone had to remember, she said finally, "My people have forgotten so much." They adopted the common tongue because it was easier, because it helped them fit in with the other species. But in doing so, they lost something precious. "The deeper meanings," Daniel said. "Yes, the layers. The connections between words and stars, between symbols and seasons. Our ancestors built an entire philosophy into our language. When we stopped speaking it, we stopped thinking in those ways." Daniel felt the sadness in her words. He thought about Earth, about all the human languages that had been lost over the centuries. He understood, at least a little, what she was describing. "I kept speaking," Vathara continued, "because I hoped that someday someone would listen. I did not expect it to be a human. But perhaps that is fitting. Your people are young. You have not yet learned to ignore what seems strange." "I want to learn more," Daniel said. "I want to understand Old Kolani fully. Will you teach me?" Vathara's smile widened. She said something in Old Kolani, a phrase that Daniel could not quite parse. "What did you say?" "I said that the student who asks to learn has already begun learning." She reached out and placed her thin hand on his. Her skin was cool and smooth, like polished stone. "I will teach you, Daniel Reyes, and perhaps, through you, my people will remember what they have forgotten." Over the following weeks, Daniel divided his time between his official duties and his private lessons with Vathara. The work was difficult. Old Kurlani was not just a language, but a way of seeing the universe. Each word carried layers of meaning that depended on context, tone, position, and even the phase in distant stars. But Daniel was a quick learner, and Vathara was a patient teacher. Slowly the fog lifted. He began to hear the music beneath her words, the patterns that connected everything together. The Kalani delegation watched with growing interest. Korath, who had once dismissed Vathara as senile, now attended some of the lessons himself. Other young Kurlani began asking questions about their own cultural heritage. "You are teaching them as much as me," Daniel observed one evening. Vathara nodded. "That was always the hope. Sometimes it takes an outsider to remind us of what we have inside." But not everyone was pleased with these developments. The warnings continued to arrive. Daniel's quarters were searched one night while he was away. A member of his security team reported being approached by someone offering money for information about his schedule. Patricia increased the protection around him. The human delegation moved to a more secure section of the station. Daniel felt like a prisoner, watched constantly, unable to move freely. Is it worth it? He asked Patricia one night, exhausted and frustrated. All of this attention, all of this danger. For what? Patricia looked at him with an expression he could not read. You changed the trajectory of galactic politics with a single translation. You stopped a war. You are teaching an ancient culture to remember its own wisdom. So yes, Daniel, it is worth it. Even if it does not feel that way right now. Daniel wanted to believe her. But the weight on his shoulders grew heavier every day. Then came the night that changed everything. He was walking back to his quarters, 2 guards flanking him, when Vathara's voice echoed in his mind. Not a memory, but something more direct, more immediate. Come to me, her voice said. There is something you must know. Daniel had never experienced Korlani mental communication before. He did not even know if such a thing was possible. But he knew, somehow, that the voice was real. He changed direction and headed for Vathara's quarters. The guards tried to stop him, but he waved them off. Wait here. I will not be long. When he entered her room, Vathara was sitting in her usual chair. But something was different. Her eyes were brighter than he had ever seen them, shifting through colors at a rapid pace. What is wrong? Daniel asked. Nothing is wrong, she said. Everything is finally right. Sit. There is something I must tell you before my time runs out. Daniel sat, his heart pounding. What do you mean, your time? Vithara smiled gently. I am old, Daniel. Older than you can understand. I have held on this long because I was waiting for someone who could carry what I know. You are that person. She reached out and placed both hands on his temples. The touch was cool and electric. Close your eyes, she said, and listen. Daniel closed his eyes. And for the first time, he heard the full song of old Kolani. Every layer, every meaning, every connection between stars and words and the endless dance of the universe. When he opened his eyes again, hours had passed. Vethara's hands had fallen to her lap. Her eyes were still shifting colors, but more slowly now. You have it all, she whispered. Everything I know. Everything my people have forgotten. Carry it forward, Daniel Race. Be the bridge between what was and what will be. Daniel felt tears on his face. He did not know when he had started crying. I will, he promised. I will not let it be forgotten. Vithara smiled one last time. I know you will not. That is why I chose you. 4 years had passed since Daniel first translated Ambassador Vethara's words for the Galactic Council. In that time, everything had changed. The old diplomat had lived for another 3 years after the night. She shared her knowledge with Daniel. Those years were good ones. She watched as her language came back to life. As young Korlani began learning the old ways again. As the council itself started to change how it thought about communication and understanding. When she finally passed, peacefully in her quarters on Station Meridian, the news traveled across the galaxy within hours. Messages of condolence came from every species in the council. Even the Morthanian Selvax, once bitter enemies, sent representatives to honor her memory. Daniel was asked to organize the memorial service. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. The great chamber of Station Meridian had been transformed. The usual seats for delegates were gone, replaced by open space where beings of every shape and size could gather together. Flowers and crystals and objects of significance from 100 worlds filled the room with color and light. Daniel stood at the center, looking out at the crowd. He saw Patricia, now an admiral, sitting in the front row. He saw Korath, who had become his close friend and one of the leading advocates for Kolani cultural revival. He saw representatives from species he had never spoken to. All gathered to honor a diplomat most of them had once dismissed as senile. When the room fell silent, Daniel began to speak. He spoke in old Korlani. The words flowed from him like water, carrying all the layers and meanings and connections that Vethara had taught him. He spoke of her life, her service, her patience. He spoke of the decades she had spent talking to people who could not hear her. He spoke of the hope she had never abandoned, even when everyone around her had given up. She never stopped talking, he said, his voice clear and strong. We simply had to learn how to listen. When he finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then, from across the chamber, a single sound. The Veth speaker, the crystalline moderator who had presided over so many council sessions, rose and spoke a phrase in its own native language. It was the first time anyone had heard it use anything other than council standard. One by one, the other delegates followed. The Morthani representative spoke in the growling tongue of his ancestors. The Selvax sang a few notes in a frequency that shimmered at the edge of hearing. Species after species offered words in their oldest languages, sounds that had not been heard in the great chamber for generations. Daniel stood in the center of it all, tears streaming down his face. This was what Vethara had hoped for. Not just understanding between two species, but a return to the depth and richness that had been lost when everyone adopted a common tongue. The council had remembered that communication was about more than efficiency. It was about connection. It was about truly hearing what others had to say. After the memorial, the council announced a new initiative. The Vathara Protocol, as it came to be known, required all species to maintain active programs for preserving their linguistic heritage. Translation training would include not just words, but context, culture, and the deeper layers of meaning that made each language unique. Daniel was asked to lead the program. He accepted on one condition: humanity would be partners, not directors. The goal was not to make humans the gatekeepers of understanding, but to help every species find their own voice again. The first class of human diplomatic translators graduated 2 years later. They were trained not just in council standard, but in the philosophies and methods that Daniel had learned from Vathara. Each one was assigned to a different species, tasked with learning their oldest languages and helping preserve what had been forgotten. Daniel taught many of them himself. He found that he enjoyed teaching, enjoyed watching young people discover the same wonder he had felt when he first started to understand the old. Ambassador. On the day of the graduation ceremony, Korath found him standing alone on an observation deck, looking out at the stars. "You should be celebrating with the others," Korath said, joining him at the window. "I will. I just needed a moment." Korath nodded. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, two beings from different worlds who'd become as close as brothers. "She would be proud of you," Korath said finally. Daniel smiled. "She would be proud of all of us." This is what she wanted. Not fame, not recognition. Just for people to hear each other again. Do you think it will last? This new understanding? Daniel considered the question. He thought about the resistance they had faced, the threats, the beings who still preferred conflict to peace. He thought about how easy it would be for the old habits to return, for efficiency to win out over depth once again. "I do not know," he admitted, "but I think it is worth trying. That is what she taught me. You do not stop speaking just because no one is listening. You keep talking, keep hoping, until someone finally hears." Korath placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You humans are strange creatures. You arrive in the galaxy knowing nothing, assuming nothing. And somehow, that ignorance becomes your greatest strength." Daniel laughed. "We prefer to call it fresh perspective. Call it whatever you like. The result is the same. You changed everything, Daniel Reyes. The galaxy will not forget." They stood together for a while longer, watching the stars spin slowly past the window. Somewhere out there, new worlds were waiting to be discovered. New species would eventually join the council. New challenges would arise, new conflicts, new opportunities for misunderstanding. But now, there was a framework in place. A reminder that communication required effort, that understanding was worth working for, that every voice deserved to be heard. Daniel thought about the journey that had brought him here. He had started as a young analyst, fresh from the academy, eager to prove himself but afraid of making mistakes. Now he was one of the most respected figures in galactic diplomacy, a bridge between species, a keeper of ancient wisdom, and it had all started because he refused to believe that an old woman was speaking nonsense. He pulled out a small device from his pocket. It was a recording of Vathara's voice, one of the first statements he had ever documented. He played it softly, letting the words fill the quiet space. "The river remembers the stone that shaped it." Daniel smiled. He understood now, fully and completely, what she had meant. The past shaped the present, but the present could also reshape how we understood the past. Everything was connected, flowing forward, carrying the impressions of what had come before while making new marks for the future. He turned away from the window and headed back toward the celebration. There were students to congratulate, colleagues to thank, a future to build. The old ambassador had given him her voice. Now it was his job to make sure it kept singing, long after both of them were gone. And somewhere, in the great flow of time and space that connected all living things, Daniel liked to think that Vathara was still speaking, still hoping, still waiting for someone to listen. because that was what she had taught. And most of all, the greatest gift you could give another being was not agreement, not obedience, not even love. It was attention. True, deep, patient attention. The willingness to hear what others were really saying. That was humanity's gift to the galaxy. Not their technology, or their ambition, or their endless curiosity. Just the simple, profound act of listening. And in the end, that had been enough to change everything.